I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Dr. Joseph Farrell. First, a couple of announcements. Watch the Forbidden documentary Occult Louisiana. This helps with our upcoming promotion for Doors of Perception, which will be available for you to rent or download early next month. Also, if you listen to the podcast through any podcast provider, listen through Spreaker. That's always free for you. We're booking guests for April. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Dr. Joseph Farrell. He has a doctorate from the University of Oxford and pursues research in physics, alternative history, and science, and everything strange. Dr. Farrell, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, Chris. How are you?
Excellent. It's great to have you back. It's been a while, but it seems that since last time we spoke that we have entered some sort of perpetual Twilight Zone episode that continues to get stranger as time passes. And I wanted to get your insights into these rapidly changing times, where we may be headed. And I also want to discuss a bit about your new book, Demon in the Ekur. There's plenty of things within this book that I have been really intrigued by, especially because ufology was one of the first things that got me started in this. And the more I learned about it, the further away my beliefs got from the little green men coming from different planets to stick things in our butts. And there seems to be many layers to this, but the possibility of intelligent plasmas being able to interact with us and shapeshift and appear as basically anything that they want to appear to us as is very intriguing to me. And I think there's some very distinct possibilities connected with this that I'd like to explore with you today. So lots to get to. Before we do, for those that may not be familiar, just remind the audience just a little bit about yourself and let them know where they can find all your work.
Well, they can find my work at my website. It's www.giza-deathstar, that's all one word, Giza, and then deathstar.com. All my books are there, and anything they want to know about me, they can they can find out there. I did a lot of academic work in my former life, and that sort of carried over into writing all these books.
Like I said in my introduction, a lot has happened since we last spoke, and I feel like I'm in a completely different reality than just 4 or 5 years ago. But I'd like to get your thoughts on everything that has unfolded politically, geopolitically around the world. Where are your thoughts on where we're at right now?
Well, if anything, I think you have to look at things primarily from the geopolitical point of view. And if you look at things that way, sociologists talk a lot about the re-emergence of civilizational states, Huntington's famous book and all of that. And I think that's to a certain extent what we're watching happen. There is worldwide a popular, or I should say populist revolt against the post-World War II neoliberal world order. And, think of Mr. Globaloney, or Der Hochklaus von Bloschwab, as I like to call him, at the World Economic Forum, and all the busybody millionaires and billionaires that meet there and plan world domination and so on and so forth. Well, that order, as far as I can tell, is collapsing. So in other words, I don't think this aspect of things was planned. In fact, I think what you're watching is Mr. Globaloney scrambling to reassert some measure of control over this process. And as a result of that, what we see happening, particularly in this country, in this second Trump administration, what we see going on is something I think was fairly predictable. We see, for example, Elon Musk and the whole Doja operation. Well, Musk, as is well known, used to be a Democrat and has all of a sudden thrown in with Mr. Trump and is now going, cleaning out, long overdue, in my opinion, about 70 years overdue, but cleaning out the federal government. But there's a downside to this in that, as far as I can tell, Mr. Musk represents technocracy, the whole globaloney fascination with technocracy as a process. So what appears to me is that for the moment, that technocratic deep state that Musk represents has decided, okay, we tried to beat him and that didn't work, so let's join him and see how far we can get with our agenda. So while I applaud what's being done with Doja, on the other hand, there's a downside to this. This is a man that wants to put computer chips in your brain. And this is a man who is running his Grok artificial intelligence program, allied with an administration that wants to introduce digital ID and all of this other stuff. So this is where I draw the line. We have to watch this administration very, very closely. I don't think it behooves us to raise alarm about too many things, but by the same token, we do have to speak up on where things are going. The old unipolar world order is over. And I think this is the other thing we need to take away from what we're seeing right now. It could change, 2 or 3 months down the line. But what we're seeing right now, Chris, I think is the death of that unipolar world order. And Mr. Trump is just as clearly as he can, I think, signaling this with some of his foreign policy initiatives. And as a result of this, Europe is finding itself, locked out of the process. They've essentially made themselves irrelevant. So this is going to be a very interesting time. We're in a paradigm shift, folks.
Essentially, what you're saying is basically a change of the old order, a change of the guard. The old order is stepping down,
right?
And we have these new players stepping in. But do you think it's the overall same desired goal, same desired direction that the old guard wanted us to head, and they're just using these new players to get it done in a more efficient way? Or are they looking towards a total paradigm change, not only for us, but in their perspective as well?
Well, it's a paradigm shift, but I go back to something, this has been my model for decades. I do think, to a certain extent, that there are elements within, I'll just call him Mr. Globaloney, that are trying to use this phenomenon. But I also think there are elements that are genuinely being kicked out and shown the door. In other words, what you're watching is something that I've suggested for many years is going to happen. As they get closer to their goal, whatever that goal is, world domination through artificial intelligence and lots of fake money, okay, in the form of electronic blips on your computer screen, whatever. As they get closer to that goal, the factions behind all of this are going to emerge into the public in open warfare with each other. You're watching a mafia. That's what you're watching. And sometimes they make common cause with each other, and sometimes they don't. And even when they're making common cause with each other, their flunkies are shooting at each other out on the street. That's what you're watching.
Mm-hmm.
So, all of this language about world order and paradigm shifts, well, you're watching a mafia war. I said when Mr. Trump decided to run the first time that he was a deep state candidate. And he still is a deep state candidate, just a different faction of it. So, the more things change, the more they remain the same.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that most of the diehard Trump supporters are either not paying attention to or they're choosing not to look at because of all the quote-unquote wonderful things that he's doing right now. But as the right hand is showing you all these shiny new things, the left hand is still in the dirty pocket and doing some things that are not very beneficial to humanity. So what are some of the things that we really should be looking at?
Well, the thing that concerns me, that besides the artificial intelligence part of this, the other thing that, and this really is not even Trump. This is a phenomenon that began to happen before Mr. Obama even left office. And it's something I think people have to watch extraordinarily closely and be bold enough to call your state legislator or your state senators and complain to them. And this is the so-called state bullion depository, state resolution for sound money, all of this stuff that we've seen emerge in the last 15 years, ever since Texas broke the ice. Texas was first out of the chute with a state bullion depository. And then quickly after that, within a few months, it was Utah with a state bullion depository. And then all of a sudden, this spread like wildfire. And while the bullion depository was going on, other states, including my home state of South Dakota, started passing these sound money, constitutional money resolutions, recognizing gold and silver specie, in other words, gold and silver coin, as legal tender, and eliminating the sales tax on these things. Okay, so initially that sounds like a good idea. What is happening, however, if you key into this phenomenon, and it's still going gangbusters, states are now passing what they're calling electronic transfer measures. In other words, the bullion depositories are going to do all of their transaction via electronic blip. And it's there, I submit to you, that you have a problem. If you do not have a certificate of deposit in your wallet that you can take to that bullion depository or your bank and demand the gold and silver specie, and then in turn be able to use that gold and silver specie in payment of transactions at your grocery store or the gas station, what you have is an electronic corporate coupon. And you have a system ripe for fraud. So if you think the current system, they want to do this audit of Fort Knox, okay, 100 years too late, guys.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you want a system that is ripe for fraud and can, at the push of a button, strip you of your assets, that's it. So it's fine if you want to have your bullion depositories. It's fine if you want to have your sound money resolutions. But by golly, follow it up that the certificate of deposit from that bullion depository has to be physical. It has to be anonymous, and you have to require by law it be accepted in transaction and clearing. Without that, all you have is a trap, and you lose your sovereignty.
One of the things really concerning to me is the emerging technocratic state and the level of
Yep.
technology that is going to be used for surveillance purposes and to keep
Ding,
tabs
ding,
on
ding.
every American. And this is being
Yep.
rolled out right under our noses right now. And this
Yeah.
is, to me, one of the most concerning things, along with the level of technology that is being utilized for this that most people
Yep.
have no
Yep.
idea about.
Well, this is my problem with these state bullion depositories and the way they're rolling it out. What you're watching being put into place is that electronic surveillance network. They want to monitor every single transaction that you have. And notice something else. There's no transparency about them. So in other words, they're erecting, Catherine Austin Fitts uses this analogy, and it's perfect. They're erecting a two-way mirror. And they're on the other side of it, and everything you do is completely transparent to them, and everything they do is completely black to us. That's fraud. Pure and simple.
100%.
So, yeah, it is. And, allow an entity like Elon Musk with his supercomputer center in Memphis, Tennessee, lose. And by the way, Tennessee is one of those states considering a state bullion depository, so no accident. So in other words, watch these people very carefully. They're trying to sneak something through via the state legislatures. And I strongly suspect, Chris, that the other reason they're trying to sneak all this technocratic surveillance through is I think the deep states within the states. Follow me? The federal government has its own deep state. Austin, Texas has another one. Oklahoma City, yet another. Indianapolis, Indiana, yet another. In other words, pick your state capital and there's another deep state there. So the deep states within the states, I think, have taken the measure at least a decade and a half ago that the federal government is in deep, deep trouble. And what you're seeing being built out is an infrastructure for if that thing ever cracks, they're ready to go. In other words, they've taken a lesson from the Confederacy. When the Confederacy was formed, and it was formed very quickly and very efficiently. However, in all those years running up to the Southern secession in 1861, when clearly there was a crack up coming, nothing was being done to build out the infrastructure needed financially for what would happen. So they had to build it on the fly and fight a war. What you're seeing now is they're building out the parallel, in my opinion, they're building out the parallel infrastructure just in case. Okay? And there's not one word about how they're going to protect the individual privacy in transaction, which can only be done through physical media of exchange. I keep drilling this, and people better get it. Those pieces of paper in your wallet may not be worth very much, but they're a heck of a lot better than mere electronic blips on your computer screen. That's the reality.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that are being presented as positive along the lines of technology. We've heard for the longest time that Mr. Musk is going to be taking us to Mars. We're going to start the new space race and colonize space. I'd like to get your thoughts on the level of technology that most people will never be aware of, that our military and some of these organizations are in possession of, mainly when you hear talk of secret space program, our capabilities. What are we already capable of, and what do you think is really behind this new space race?
Okay. Two things here that I can pull right off the top of my head. Pardon me. There's all this talk recently about plasma engines. The Russians, I saw a story, the Russians came out and announced they have a plasma engine that can get us to Mars in 30 days. We don't need this 6-month-long traverse time to Mars and blah, blah, blah. Well, here's the thing. A plasma engine is nothing but a nuclear rocket. That's all it is.
Wow.
Okay. Now, we've had those around in this country since the 1950s. And so have the Russians. And by now, probably the Chinese and the Indians and the Europeans. So this is nothing new. However, there's a problem. When you're putting a bunch of plutonium up in space to power your rocket, you're going to leave a little trail of radioactivity in addition to all the radioactivity that's out there already. So how are you going to survive? Well, Mr. Musk has a plan, and that is to alter humanity itself. And there's the rub. I'm perfectly satisfied with the way God made me. I don't want computer chips in my brain. Okay. I think there's got to be a better way than all of this. But Mr. Musk is in a hurry. And he wants to, and notice that he's doing this in exactly the way they always promote these types of tinkerings with humanity. Oh, it'll be so wonderful because we can make blind people able to see and deaf people able to hear. And we're going to heal the paralyzed. We're literally substituting a set of technocratic miracles for Christ. That's what we're doing. And Musk is selling all of this that, okay, we're going to be able to accomplish all these wonderful medical things. He's not telling you about the potential downside, that while he's out there sailing with humanity version 2.0 to Mars on his plasma rockets, he's got you wired up to the cloud. And he will be able to tinker and monitor with your thoughts, your emotions, your dreams, when you sleep, when you wake, how much you eat, and so on. And frankly, that's a beast system. There's a reason that I said we're using this in the place of Christ. Antichrist means in the place of.
Well, to get a little deeper in the conspiracy waters, there are some that believe.
Yeah, that's very.
There's some
deep.
that believe this is already occurring against our will, that we're already being altered in some ways.
Yeah. Well, look at the mRNA vaccines during the COVID thing. I definitely think that this was a deliberate attempt, a beta trial, a beta test, to test their mechanisms and techniques for the actual alteration of the human genome. And if you're following what's been happening with the quacksines, as I like to call them, the stories that are coming out about the bizarre deaths, the spike proteins modifying DNA, and all women, prepubescent girls experiencing menstruation, and all of this bizarre stuff that is happening. Again, I think this was a deliberate attempt to try and force people to accept a modification of their very existence. So I can sympathize with those people that think that this is already being done, because to a certain extent I agree with that. It has been done.
Going back to the secret space program.
Okay.
How advanced is our space technology? Do you think that we have already been to Mars? What level do you think that our private military sector is at?
I think it is possible that our technology is very advanced in this respect. And I say that, Chris, for two reasons. Let's go back to one of my favorite topics, the Nazi bell. Okay, if you accept the research that people like Igor Vitkovsky or I forget the guy's name, The Hunt for Zero Point, or the research that I've done, that others have done on the bell, it is very clear that during the Second World War, towards the end of it, there was some sort of prototypical breakthrough in anti-gravity technology on the part of the Nazis. Now, all that the bell was reported as being able to do was simply levitate. And it could only do that if it was still tethered to the ground and receiving massive amounts of electrical power. They had to build a power station at the testing site, just to have enough power to do this. But nevertheless, they got this thing, whatever it was, to levitate. Okay? That's the reports. It has been now almost 80 years since the end of the Second World War. And in that amount of time, with the vast amounts of money that I think were created at the end of World War II, when the United States government, Harry Truman, took the decision to recover all of that Japanese gold and do it covertly and keep that gold supply under the direct control of the National Security Council. So, in other words, what I'm telling you is Harry Truman put the American intelligence agency and community into the banking business. The reason why is very clear. You need gobs of money if you're going to do a mega Manhattan-sized project, researching exotic technology and perfecting it. And you can't do that by openly taxing the people because, number one, they're going to revolt at that amount of taxes. And number two, they're going to want to know what it's for. So you have to set up a completely black, and I'm not talking black budget. Please understand what I'm saying here. I'm saying an entirely hidden system of finance, totally off the books. Congress has nothing to do with it. To make a system like that work, you're taking all of that recovered Japanese gold, you're building a huge pile of liquidity on top of it, and you can, since it's hidden, you can rehypothecate it over and over and over again. So in 80 years, what could you do with hundreds of trillions of dollars, a completely covert development of a technology that began to appear towards the end of World War II? In my opinion, probably earlier than that. You could literally have a technology capable of getting us to Mars, and we would know nothing about it. So do I think it's possible? Yes, I do. Do I think we've actually been there? All I can tell you is I think it's mighty fishy that we seem to know exactly where to send our probes to Mars and snap photographs. It's like we're batting 1,000 here, folks. And so far, NASA puts the picture out. Well, that's just a trick of light and shadow. And here's another one. So yeah, I tend to be a bit suspicious as to what's been going on.
Well, what are your thoughts about those that say we can't get past the Van Allen belts? It's impossible.
Oh, boy.
That we wouldn't be able to use traditional rocketry, basically. It would have to be some sort of wormhole or jump room.
Oh, boy. Okay. Well, I hate to disappoint that crowd. The problem with radiation is that radiation is a function of the amount of exposure over time. Okay? That's all it is. The problem of traversing the Van Allen belts is you've got to tell me, and no one has been able to run the math on this, at least as far as I know. How quickly are you traversing the Van Allen belts, and how much dosage are you receiving during the transit? That's problem number one. So in other words, you go in and you get an x-ray at your dentist. Okay? That x-ray is exposing you to radiation. And over time, that exposure can build up to the point, Chris, and people may not remember this. I'm old enough because my parents told me about it. You could go into department stores in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and they would have an x-ray machine, and you put on your shoes, and then you watch the x-ray of your shoe and your feet inside the shoe, and that was supposed to help you decide whether or not it was a good fit. So you had people dosing themselves in shoe stores and department stores with x-rays, and then, oh, by the way, over time, this builds up in your system, and you could get radiation poisoning from it. Probably better take those machines out of the stores, which eventually, of course, they did. So the Van Allen belts to me it's one of these non-starters of an argument that make no sense. That's problem number one. Problem number two is if you look at some of this exotic technology like the bell, one of the things that they notice about it is that inside it's like a Faraday cage. Inside you're not exposing yourself to that much. The effects of the bell on things outside of it are really nasty. Okay. So in other words, if you've got an exotic technology that's going to get you through the Van Allen belts fairly quickly and able to land you on the moon and then get off that moon, chances are that technology is going to be able to do some sort of shielding. So I've never bought the idea that this is all that big a concern. Now, over time, a 6-month trip to Mars in your conventional tin can rocket, that's a different story. That's a different story. So to my mind, they, by the nature of the case, Chris, and I hope people are latching on to what I'm saying, by the nature of the case, when they're talking about these 6-month journeys to Mars, by the nature of the case, they have to have some exotic technology to combat that radiation exposure, whatever it may be. Special suits, special shielding, I don't care what it is, an electromagnetic bubble around, I don't care. But they have to have something.
Right.
There you go.
Well, let's transition into your new book for the second half of the show, The Demon in the Ekur. Okay. First of all, what brought you to write the book, and give us a synopsis?
Well, the book, you know my books. I like to put epigraphs at the beginning of every chapter. When I first did the Giza Death Star years and years ago, I sent it off to a publisher, and I had an epigraph that was taken directly from Zecharia Sitchin. And the epigraph simply talked about the demon in the Ekur. And Ekur is an E-K-U-R. It's not A-C-R-E, as someone confusingly said. But Ekur is the Akkadian word for a ziggurat or a mountain. So in other words, it's their word for a pyramid. So Sitchin was saying there was a demon in a pyramid. And it's one of these ancient texts that he likes to talk about. Well, I originally put that epigraph in the original version of the Giza Death Star. I sent it off to a publisher. The publisher took about 3 months, and then they finally got back with me and said, no, we're not interested in publishing this. And I thought, well, great. Because I've crunched more numbers, and I've decided that, talking about demons and pyramids is just going to mess up an already messy hypothesis. So I decided to remove that epigraph in the version of the book that was finally published. Then many years later, and, God bless him for this, Robert Temple decided to bite the bullet. And it was a bullet I didn't want to bite back when I sent Giza Death Star off, because I thought, no, people are going to pillory me for writing a book about the pyramid being a weapon in the first place. The last thing we need to do is add demons to it, and plasmas that are intelligent. That's the last thing that we need to do. So Robert Temple last year published a book that's called The New Science of Heaven. It's a wonderful book. And it's about the plasma life hypothesis. And then as a subset of that, it's about the fact that, well, some of this plasma might even be intelligent. All right. And when the book came out, I thought, oh, now I can write what I should have put in the original Giza Death Star, but was too afraid to do. And that's literally how it came about. So I wrote The Demon in the Ekur about the demon part of all of this. You do not need that component for the weapon hypothesis, but it is a kind of supplemental part of the story. The reason that the hypothesis is so wild is because the very famous, very well known plasma and quantum physicist by the name of David Bohm. If you ever take quantum mechanics, chances are you might run across his textbook, to learn it. He had his own version of quantum theory, and as a plasma physicist, he worked in the Manhattan Project. And all of a sudden, he quit because he discovered that every time he tried to insert an electronic probe into his uranium plasma, he got a very strange response. The plasma would simply encase the probe with little bits of plasma sticking to the probe, and he could not take any measurements. For David Bohm, that was an aha moment because that's exactly the response of an organism and its immunosystem response to the invasion of a foreign bacillus or bacterium or something. It will encase it and wall it off from the rest of the organism with a bunch of T cells. And as plasma physicists explored what plasmas do and how they operate, it very quickly became clear that they were dealing with something that in almost every respect mimics the behavior of organisms. Plasmas have membranes, they have tubes, and in some cases, famous stories about ball lightning, appearing to examine the patterns on Persian rugs and all sorts of very strange stuff. When you add it all together, you get a hypothesis that these things might actually be living organisms of a very different sort than we're used to, and that some of them might be intelligent. And just for kicks and giggles, in that book, Chris, you're probably familiar with the picture that I put in there. There are two pictures in the book. One is of the plasma filaments in the known universe that connect to each other. Now, that in itself should tell you that there's something massively wrong with the relativistic universe that you and I have been taught is good physics. Okay? Because these filaments connect to each other in gigantic structures. And then there's another picture in the book of the neurons and synapses in a human brain. And when you look at the picture of the neurons and synapses and the plasma filaments in the universe, they're almost identical in structure. So if you extend the plasma life hypothesis, and again, I'm kind of summarizing Robert Temple's book here. If you extend that hypothesis, you get enormous plasma structures that are exhibiting the neurophysiology of a brain. And here it comes, on a cosmic scale. Okay, not just galactic, cosmic. So, all of those ancient texts about, the bodiless powers or intelligences or whatever you want to call them, it looks like there might have been all along some sort of basis in real hard physical fact. And one final thing to note, my specialty is patristics, the study of the Christian church fathers. So I put a lengthy quotation of a church father by the name of St. John of Damascus right at the beginning of The Demon in the Ekur. Because when you read him and then you read what the plasma physicists are saying about plasmas, it's eerily similar. Well, one of the things that he points out, this church father, is that when you compare angels or demons to us, they appear to have no material existence at all. But, he says, when you compare them to God, they are still a very, very fine type of matter, almost like a dust. Okay. Well, if you look at plasma, in many cases, this is what you're dealing with, a very, very fine, almost immaterial type of matter. There's plasma between the Earth and the Moon, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a very strange hypothesis, and I want to emphasize it is a hypothesis.
Well, maybe,
But it is
go ahead.
it is one I think is worth considering, especially that we're going to be going out there, and maybe maybe what we're doing is playing in someone's backyard. Right. That's the thing to consider.
Well, you mentioned ball lightning, and maybe we could give
Yeah.
some examples of plasma that maybe people can observe for themselves, or at least become aware in generalities. And how do we make this connection to intelligence or even angels or demons?
Okay, easy. I'll tell you why. In the book, I put a picture of the Trinity atomic bomb test in New Mexico. And the picture was snapped. It was taken 1/4 of a second after the detonation. And what you see in the picture is a big ball, okay? And you'll very clearly see in the picture regions, different discrete regions inside the plasma. In other words, it's not a homogeneous thing. In fact, there's one region that looks almost completely empty. And then you'll see these little fingers, little filaments emerging from that ball, trying to stretch down to the ground. Okay? Now, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that in that short span of time of a nuclear detonation, you have actually created a life form. I think it is possible that this might be one of the reasons why from 1944 to the end of World War II, you began to see all of this UFO foo fire balls of light activity. Because if you have plasma as a life form, and then all of a sudden, bang, they hear the cry of something that sounds like one of them, what are you going to do? You're going to investigate. You're going to investigate. And that's what I think happens. Now, I'm not saying that every phenomenon of ufology is plasma. I'm not in the camp that thinks that all UFOs are one phenomenon. I think they are several phenomena of different types. But plasma may be one of them. So I think, yes, if you incorporate the plasma life hypothesis into what's going on at the end of World War II, you have a possibility that some of this is being done in response to the nuclear detonations. And by the way, yes, I believe the Germans had a nuclear detonation prior to the end of World War II, and that's why they're showing up over there. Okay? So, yeah, I think this is something at least that has to be considered now that Temple has written his book.
Now, going back to the different forms of plasma, like I said, you mentioned ball lightning. Our blood is considered plasma. Would you consider all of these different forms of plasmas to have levels of intelligence?
I think, yes, I would myself. And it's interesting that you mentioned blood, because the term for plasmas in the sense that we're talking about, nuclear plasma and so on, it was deliberately borrowed from biology and suggested by the physicists themselves. So in other words, as they began to tinker with plasmas, the resemblance to life became immediately apparent. And David Bohm finally broke the ice and said, I quit. We're experimenting with something that's alive. And he just quit.
Yeah.
So yeah, this has been the big secret they don't want to talk about. I think it's possible that the hypothesis is going to be vindicated. The real problem is the intelligence part. And ball lightning is interesting here because most physicists think that ball lightning is some sort of plasma. And it certainly behaves like a plasma when you try and deal with it. But the interesting thing about ball lightning is that it appears to be curious. You know, it will show up in airplanes and kind of saunter down the aisle of airplanes and then stop. And some people think that, well, it's trying to get a response to thing. In other cases, you have reports of it coming down chimneys, in France and Europe, coming down chimneys and entering a room, and the room has a Persian rug in it. And the plasma goes around and appears to be examining the pattern on the rug. It's just strange stuff. So if you're having activity like that, it tends to indicate that at some point there is a life and curiosity and intelligence behind it. In other words, you got ball lightning behaving like a dog. What's it doing? It's sniffing the rug. It's trying, what is this thing? So it's exhibiting some sort of rudimentary intelligence. And here's the kicker. When you're dealing with a plasma, like the Great Sloan Wall, which is something that Temple writes about in his book, which is a plasma structure that is, and I did the back of the envelope calculation, and I can never remember exactly what the figure is, but it's something like 187 septillion miles long. Now, folks, that's a little problem for general relativity. If you have a structure, a coherent structure that is 100 and some odd septillion miles long, then stop and think. If this structure is exhibiting all of those plasma filaments, in other words, if this structure is a gigantic brain, is it, what are we to it? Well, chances are we're probably an interesting bacteriological curiosity.
Yeah.
But intelligent, we've begun to scratch the surface. And my end day scenario is what happens when our best human AI comes up against one of those.
Right. Well, it's very interesting if you observed the recent incidents with the drones and some of the videos that people had posted. It seemed to show these plasma-like lights, formations interacting with the drones, even communicating with people, which seems to be more and more videos seem to be surfacing of this.
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible, again, because let's look at the problem of the plasma life hypothesis. David Bohm notices this in the 1940s. So in other words, the other aspect of off-the-books physics and so on, secret space programs, is how early along was this noticed and recognized, and what did they decide to do about it? Well, if a certain group, you know as well as I do, Chris, the way this government operates. If a certain group of scientists in the Black Projects world say, okay, well, we don't know whether or not these things are alive and intelligent, so what do? Well, we'd better test the hypothesis. How do we do that? Well, we attempt to communicate with it. And if it responds in some consistent way over time to our inquiries or attempts at communication, then we have a pretty good idea that this stuff is alive and intelligent. So would they do that? Yeah, of course they would. They'd devote buku amounts of money to it.
There seems to be areas that have more concentration of this phenomena than others. And I'm talking about places like Skinwalker Ranch. I recently went visit my friend Ryan Burns. He has a Space Wolf Research Center out there. And he was telling me about this phenomena that would occur very often, these orbs of light that would come out of nowhere, but they seem to
Right.
shapeshift and change into different things. He saw one that was just an orb of light that changed into a plane and then changed into a bird
Mm-hmm.
and then shot off.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be
Mm-hmm.
that we're witnessing these plasmas
Sure.
shapeshifting in front of us?
Yeah, they might be doing that as a means to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of explanations for it, and again, the lore on this type of phenomena is very, very old. Shape-shifting phenomenon have been in the lore from India to Mesoamerica. And it's in Islamic lore, it's in Christian lore, Jewish lore, Hindu lore, Buddhist lore. It's all over. So now we're to the point that, yeah, we're dealing with a scientific thing that appears to fit some of the bills of the lore. So could this phenomenon that your friend has observed out at the Skinwalker Ranch be happening? Sure. I don't rule
Well, it
anything
seems
out
to have
at
crossover
this stage.
to
Yeah.
paranormal phenomena in general, and it makes
Yeah.
me wonder, could
Yeah.
this be the same phenomena that we've been experiencing throughout history, but a
Sure.
shape-shifting intelligence that appears as whatever it wants?
Yeah, it could be. And the question is, why is it doing that? Well, again, is it trying to communicate? Is it trying to overawe? What's the motivation here? But I strongly suspect that, if you're dealing with a phenomenon that you've literally borrowed a biological term and applied it to the physical phenomenon, plasma in this case, because you've noticed that it's exhibiting behaviors and responses that are similar to organic life, you know, then by the nature of the case, you're going to investigate this. So I genuinely think that there's some sort of plasma life phenomenon that they've been investigating on the QT for a number of years, and that this may explain why you have so much strange activity at places like Skinwalker or concentrations of it in certain areas. Because if they're going to do this, where are they going to do it? Well, they're going to do it where there have been reports of this type of phenomenon over time.
Well, this brings me to their level of understanding, and could it have already been weaponized? We look at
Sure.
the UFO disclosure movement, and there's a definite narrative behind it, and we have our government and mainstream media consistently reporting on it. But for years before, our Hollywood entertainment has been seeding this view of extraterrestrials and aliens and what would it be like if we got invaded. Could it be that they have a great understanding of how these plasma intelligences work, and they've figured out a way, in a sense, to manipulate it and use it on a larger scale to maybe use it for psychological operations, in a sense?
Wow, that's a complex question. It's actually several questions.
Right.
But number one, would they attempt to study it and then make use of it or weaponize it, as you said? Answer, sure they would. Sure they would. But here's the problem. If you, again, I go to the Great Sloan Wall, this gigantic plasma structure that's septillions of miles long. Any thought that you have in a mere 80 years or however long you've been experimenting with the phenomenon, any thought that you have mastered it should go right out the window. Because if that phenomenon is intelligent, more likely it is using you rather than the other way around.
Yes.
So would they be doing this? Yes. Would they think that they have successfully weaponized it? Yes. Will it possibly at some point in the future rise up to bite them in the you know what? Yes. Or to put it like C.S. Lewis put it in one of his space novels, when you call down high heaven on yourself, don't be surprised if it shows up.
Right.
You know? And that's what they're doing, quite frankly.
It definitely seems to have at least the appearance of duality, or possibly it's just a manipulation, but it can play to either positive or negative experiences, angels or demons. Sure. Do you think that it is, in a sense, like humans where they have positive and negative aspects, or is it just flowing with whatever we put out there?
No, I think it's a bit of both. In other words, it's kind of a feedback loop. The problem I think that we have to wrap our minds around is that when you're dealing with something that big, it's no doubt also very old. And it's going to have certain, if it's existing entirely inside of time, it's going to have a certain habit of will built up. So I think, you're dealing with things that can be good or evil, but in the nature of the thing, they've had a long time to practice being one or the other. That's what I'm getting. There's in the medieval scholastic theology, Thomas Aquinas writes a very interesting thing about the habit of will of angels and demons, for that matter, because he says because they exist kind of outside of time, and they even coin a word in the medieval scholastic theology for this kind of beginning to have existence but continuing existence in perpetuity after that. They called it sempiternal. Okay, so in that sempiternal world where it's both kind of inside of time and kind of outside of time, the first use of the will is already the establishment of the entire habit of the will. So if you can imagine something like the Great Stone Wall, that you have this immense being that is probably immensely intelligent, it's going to have a habit of will. And either way, good or ill, I'm just a little paramecium down here on this blue ball called Earth, and I don't want to tangle with it. Right. Okay, one way or the other, leave me out. There's a reason that in those old texts, when certain people see angels, they fall on their face. And usually it's out of some sort of fear. And then, the angel says, fear not, blah, blah, blah. But these things were not little fat cherubs in a Rubens painting, with dainty little angel wings, and a little arrow. No, that's not what they were. Yeah. So the actual, if you were to try and depict these things, I think you'd have to depict them in a kind of a hyperdimensional geometric way, because they're not going to squeeze into any sort of box that's familiar to us. So yeah, I think you're right. They've got this dualistic aspect to them, but all the more reason to be very careful if you're studying these things. Now, who knows what this government in its black projects did? Given the kind of people involved in that world, I have to shudder, because at some point, that they're going to do something either intentionally or unintentionally cruel.
Well, if these are what could be considered angels or demons, and we look to our ancient ancestors that use ritual and magic to communicate with this, fast forward today, those that have the understanding of this maybe are still using ritual and magic, but we have levels of technology on top of that to strengthen whatever type of communication. And I think at some point, we just need to stop. As far as these technological advancements, there's some things that I don't think we should be exploring because we're just not ready for it.
Here. I'm totally agreed with you. Just because we
Right.
can do it doesn't mean we should. You know, just because we can split the atom, too late, but we did. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we should. Uh, Plasmas, just the hypothesis of plasma life should give people a lot of pause.
Right.
Because that means it's all around us. The sun, what's the sun? It's a plasma. What's lightning in a thunderstorm? It's a plasma. And on we could go. And, what are we? Well, we're bioelectric creatures that appear to have some sort of use of quantum tunneling that holds our organism together. And, once we've said that, we're in a plasma universe of a sort. So, we're playing around with things, Chris. I don't think that I'm with you. I don't think we should be playing around with, but they're going to do it.
Yes, they are. There's no stopping that. But we are definitely in fascinating times, and I am really enjoying the level of information that's being shared right now from people like yourself. And I hope it continues, and we can continue to gain better understandings of our high strange reality. Before we close out, is there anything you have interesting upcoming? Any projects that you'd like to let us know about?
Well, you mentioned the Demon in the Ekur. That was actually the sequel to the Giza Death Star Revisited, which was a rewriting, I should say, of the original Giza Death Star books with more information. So people might be interested in that book. And since then, since those two books, I've had another new book called The Rialto in Richmond come out about what it sounds like it's about. And then the sequel I just mailed off to the publisher, and that's called The Rialto in Richmond Reconstructed. So everything dirty and nasty about the war between the states that you didn't want to know.
Yeah.
It's in those books.
My favorite kind. Wonderful. Yeah. Dr. Farrell, thank you so much. We'll definitely love to do this again in the future. And until next time, everyone, have a wonderful evening. We'll talk again tomorrow.
Thanks, Chris.
We live in an incredible age of information. More and more, we're discovering that we've been lied to and misled about much of our human history. Cory Hughes is providing profound revelations about World War I, World War II, the JFK assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, and much, much more on his new Substack, Bloody History. Subscribe now for as little as $5 monthly. Just click that link right in the description to get started now and learn about our true history.